Welcome to my short video on T.M. Scanlon's Objections to Welfarism. So first, some context as to who T.M. Scanlon is. Some of you might find the name familiar. T.M. Scanlon wrote a very famous book on contractualism, which is a development of the idea of Nagel's acceptability, and the book is called What We Owe to One Another, which was made pretty famous in the TV show A Good Place. And in that show, there's a pretty good elucidation of some of Scanlon's ideas, so I would recommend it to everyone. T.M. Scanlon also wrote another important book, Why Does Inequality Matter, which we will look at tangentially in our discussion of equality, or inequality specifically. But on to his famous objections to welfarism, which we actually do see in both What We Owe to Each Other and Why Does Inequality Matter. So, Scanlon has two main objections to welfarism, both of which he develops at some length throughout many years, but which first really appeared in this very famous paper called Preference and Urgency. And I didn't ask you to read Preference and Urgency because actually the bulk of the argument can briefly be summarized in these two problems, both of which have to do with religious belief in one way or another, although I think that there is an open question as to whether or not religious belief is actually central to the argument. So let's look at that in a short while, but let's review the two problems first, starting with, of course, naturally, the religious belief problem. So the religious belief problem is something like that. Suppose you have a religious person, I guess this stock photo kind of shows that, and you have a totally non-religious person. I'm sure some of you will know this, Richard Dawkins. Now, imagine that in this society, it's pretty hard for a religious person to live, right? So they feel some guilt, right? The society in general is pretty difficult for them to maintain in some way. A struggle, but not impossible. It's not difficult. There's no persecution. It's just that the way that the society is set up makes it difficult for a religious person to adhere to their beliefs, right? So the religious person will have some kind of loss to their well-being. Let's say they only manage to gain 1,000 utils because the society is not in a way set up for them, right? But the non-religious person, right, the society is more amenable to them, so they have 10,000 utils, right? So this is sort of the basic setup that we are talking about. Then on to the problem. So Scanlon wants to say that if we have equality of welfare, that would require that we compensate the religious person, right? But Scanlon thinks that doesn't quite make sense, right, for a few reasons. First of all, that seems to be at odds with the idea of religion, right? That why should one be compensated for one's religious beliefs, right? One should adhere to those religious beliefs because one is willing or should be willing to accept the cause, right, as it were. Right, so here's a very sort of famous articulation of this from a Bible verse: none of you can be my disciple who does not give up on his own possessions, right? Here, of course, presumably we can interpret it as material possessions, but we can also interpret it in terms of well-being, right? That worldly, material, or generally even just your well-being in the earthly well-being, so to speak, right? That is something that you should be willing to sacrifice if you are a true believer adherent to the religion, right? And we can also see this idea in other kinds of religions, right? That having religious beliefs means being willing to sacrifice, right? And we can also even see in other religious contexts, right, that this idea that we should try our best to give up on our worldly attachments, right? Buddhism or some versions of Buddhism, right? Especially like Mahayana Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, right? There's this idea that what is causing our suffering, right, is precisely our attachment to the world, and we should try our best to sort of detach ourselves insofar as this is possible, right? So this idea that religious beliefs, in other words, would require us to move away from earthly well-being seems inherent to religious belief, right? So that already seems antithetical to the idea that we should compensate the religious person. That's kind of the idea that Scanlon wants to get with that paragraph which Cohen quotes in full to get you to actually show you what Scanlon is actually arguing, right? This idea that we shouldn't compensate for the religious belief because it seems inherent to the idea of religion that we should not do so. Now, one might think that there's a question about whether or not this is applicable to all moral beliefs, right? So you can see the picture here, right, which is a protest by vegans. I believe this is in the Philippines, right? And there's this idea then that, right, it's not very hard for us to imagine, right? As an exercise, I want you to think, but does this apply to veganism too? Suppose you don't have to imagine this very hard, right? That the world is structured such that it's very difficult for someone who does not want to eat meat to feel guilty about the general state of the world, right? So vegans in this case, they will feel very guilty, right? That their well-being will generally be affected, right? Even though nobody is forcing them to eat meat, say there's no persecution per se. But looking at the world around them, their well-being might be badly affected. So one question we might have is then, should they be compensated? And now, this thought might not seem so bad, right? But what if we put in then wrong moral beliefs into the mix, right? So for example, if someone has racist beliefs, then suppose, and we don't have to imagine quite hard, that the world is structured such that it's very difficult for them to not feel that the world, something is wrong with the world, right? Yes, we persecute racists, but we also tolerate some of them in some sense, where we let them say, in some countries, we let them say certain things or espouse certain kinds of beliefs, right? Now, that person's well-being might be badly affected, but should we compensate them? Then obviously the answer we know, right? But the vegan case sort of maybe is more clear, right? That perhaps if we think that there is some moral ground, right, should we compensate them? One question then is that, does even the objectivist welfarists face a similar kind of problem, right? That should we compensate for people whose well-being might be in some way harmed by the fact that they have certain kinds of maybe costly moral beliefs, so to speak. And this is a question I want you to think about as you read the Cohen. So the urgency problem goes something like that. Scanlon invites us to imagine someone that attaches great significance to building a religious monument, which typically, as you might know, is not cheap, right? It's pretty costly. So here are sort of two nice examples of this. Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro and Borobudur Temple in Yogyakarta. Now imagine that this person places so much significance to building the monument, in fact, that they would be willing to forego a proper diet to do so, right? They just are not getting enough nutrition. They would rather channel those resources to building the monument. And I hope that all of us can agree that this is not a very unrealistic example. So the thought is then that the welfarist view, if we understand it as hedonism or desire satisfaction, right, would say that we should subsidize this activity. But as we intuitively think, this is problematic, right? Now, as you will see when you read the full paragraph that Cohen cites from Scanlon, Scanlon doesn't say that we should not subsidize this activity at all, meaning that he doesn't think that we have no reason whatsoever to subsidize this activity, but he is saying that it seems that the welfarist view cannot say that we have a greater interest in ensuring that the person has a proper diet, no matter how much significance they attach to this particular task, right? So what the thought here is that common sense seems to say very strongly that we should attend to the more urgent need here, which is ensuring that the person has a proper diet, right? But welfarism cannot draw this kind of distinction. It cannot distinguish between interests that are merely optional and interests that are truly urgent. And that poses a significant problem, right, in prioritizing the different kinds of interests that we might have. And that, in a nutshell, is the urgency problem. And that brings us to an end of this video. I have discussed two problems that Scanlon talks about. First of all, the religious belief problem, and then the urgency problem. Look forward to discussing this in greater detail in class. See you then. Thank you.